Hello and welcome to the Centre Think Tank's podcast, In Conversation. As always, I'm your host, Will Barber-Taylor, and in this episode, I'm delighted to be joined in asking questions today by Torrin Wilkins, the director of the Centre Think Tank. And the recipient of our questions is Neil Kinnock, Lord Kinnock of Bedwellty, the former leader of the Labour Party from 1983 to 1992. Welcome to the podcast, Neil.
Hello, thanks very much for having me.
It's great to have you on. Now, the first question I'd like to ask is, how important do you think mining was in shaping the politics of Wales and your own political upbringing?
Um, well, coal mining, I think probably any mining, has distinctive characteristics as an industrial occupation, as a means of economic exploitation. The first characteristic, of course, is perpetual danger for those engaged in it. And it's very arduous work, which generates a lot of dirt, so that whilst the miners take the risks and endure the hardship, their families, particularly their wives, have got a great deal of household obligation, dealing with filthy clothes, very dirty men, certainly until the arrival of pithead baths in the 1920s and 30s, and particularly in the 1940s after nationalization. So the whole family were engaged unavoidably in the act of digging out the coal. The second really strong characteristic is almost by definition that settlement is around the pit. So that leads to congested housing and the establishments of communities that are directly dependent upon, almost solely dependent upon, the coal mine. All of those two features breeds a sense of community, of interdependence, both because of the nature and danger of the work and the hazardous working conditions, but also because of the close proximity of where you live, where your family lives, where the whole of society is developing around the pit. And that in turn breeds a spirit of collectivism, the understanding that very few freedoms and assets that individual human beings need are available to them by purchase because of low wages and difficult conditions, so that collective activity, whether in terms of work or in terms of social conduct, is a very straightforward reality of life. It's the only way to get along, really, because there are no individual coal miners. The nature and structure of the communities means that there is an understanding of neighborhood that goes right into the bone marrow. And that's in the nature of a mining community. It's fairly common to some other communities, the cotton industry, for instance, or the steel industry, but even those communities were more diverse and widespread than the very tightly knit coal mining community. When I was growing up in such a community in Tredegar in southeast Wales, what used to be Monmouthshire, at the northern edge of the coalfield, literally at the very top of the valley in which I live, the Sir Howie Valley, and it's across the valleys, of course, that most of the bituminous coal was developed. Coking coal, steam coal, vitally for driving industry and maritime trade. So that community, when I was growing up, was about 17 to 20,000 people. And my father was a coal miner who became disabled and had to become a steel worker. My mother was a district nurse. I was very fortunate. I was an only child, and there were two incomes in the household. My grandfathers were both coal miners, as all my uncles, except one, had also been at some time in their lives. But the Depression of the 1930s scattered my father's brothers all over the United Kingdom. And just my father and his eldest brother continued to work in the industry and then in the locality. The reason that I'm giving you this long tale about the nature and structure of the mining industry and communities is that I didn't come from a stridently political background. My parents were both convinced socialists and trade unionists, as indeed were the rest of my family and our friends and neighbors. But really, it was the realization by the time I was about, I don't know, maybe 10, certainly by the age of 12, that all the good things that we enjoyed in that community had been collectively developed, financed, organized, whether it was the national provision, like the National Health Service, which was born in Tredegar, and all the concepts followed by Aneurin Bevan, who was our Member of Parliament, when he became the Minister of Health after the war, had been developed over the previous 50 years in the Tredegar Medical Aid Society, which collected tiny contributions from just about all the workers in Tredegar in order to develop a comprehensive, high-quality system, free at the time of need, the essential concepts of the National Health Service. But whether it was that national provision, because I was born in 1942, the health service came into existence in 1948. My mother worked for it, as she'd worked for the Medical Aid Society after she completed her training, or the education system, which was benefiting from the 1944 Education Act implemented by the Labour government of 1945, or the Workman's Hall, the glorious cinema, the park, the swimming pool, the tennis courts, the libraries, the dance hall, all the good things, and many of which we could never have afforded as a family, were available to us because of collective action. So I guess that the step from understanding that to realizing that this was applied socialism, practical, everyday provision by collective means, where we could exercise freedoms, this is the essence of it, that we never could have exercised otherwise. Basically, that meant that I guess the concept of socialism was in my veins long before I came to comprehend socialism as an ideology. It was a means of mundane action, a way of life, really, which was easy for me to understand. And whilst that wasn't uniquely associated with coal mining. The points that I made earlier to you about the collective and community nature, unavoidably, of communal development around a coal mine meant that collective action wasn't a matter of developed organization. It was a matter of instinct and the reality of existence. So, I mean, that's really where it came from. Years later, of course, I realized it could be developed into a coherent way of thinking about the world, society, the economy. And by the time I was 14, I also recognized that if we were going to secure improvements, and there was always a need and room for improvement, for making things better, then it had to be organized. So I joined the Labour Party, naturally. And right, that's where I come from.
Just to move forward a bit in terms of your career, we recently published an article on the website marking 44 years since the creation of the SDP, and I just wondered, reflecting on that period from 44 years ago to today, I suspect that your feelings haven't changed, but have your feelings about the SDP changed at all, and about that particular time in politics?
No, I mean, my wife was a woman with great insights. And back in the early 80s, when the Social Democratic Party was formed, she said, well, it's easy to see what they stand for. They're Labour without the unions and with the bomb. And I think that really summed up the SDP pretty comprehensively. You could relate their origins to a strong commitment to the European community. But basically, they were a group of members of parliament who grew very impatient with what they saw as increasing leftward inclination of the Labour Party. And instead of staying and combating that with confidence in their own set of beliefs, nuances, they split. And of course, it caused immense damage to the Labour Party. Apart from anything else, it means that the anti-conservative vote by 1983 was divided, and Mrs. Thatcher could get 100% of the power, which she used with 1,000% authority on the basis of 43% of the vote, with the Labour and Social Democrat votes divided against her. But when I became leader in 83, the main problem that I identified with the Social Democrats was that they had adopted political stances that were appealing to both Labour and Liberal and some Conservative voters. And it meant that in my efforts to shift and in some cases radically change Labour Party policies, I was perpetually accused of wanting the SDP Mark II. So far from assisting with, if you like, the re-education and reorientation of the Labour Party, they actually impeded it, because I had to offer the reassurance and exercise even more time and energy on securing change for Labour, because of the unfavorable comparison with our those in conflict with us from the Social Democrats. And I've never changed that view. In addition, the Social Democrats from their very early stage, back in 1980-81, were committed to proportional representation. And yet they failed to understand that the only way in which we were going to get a more proportionate system, was, since we would never get it from a Conservative government, was by a Labour government, and their action in dividing the Labour vote very, very seriously impeded any arguments in favour of electoral reform. So they were, in a sense, self-denying in that respect, as well as destructive. So on the basis of the harm that they did to the Labour Party and the deceleration of any movement towards what I consider a more democratic and proportionate system, they were a bloody nuisance.
I think that's a fair enough answer. Robert Harris suggested in his book, The Making of Neil Kinnock, that you held more power between 1974 and 1979 outside government than within it. In retrospect, did you ever think that, although it wouldn't have been an electoral benefit to you in the 1983 leadership contest, that you may have benefited from some experience had you had a ministerial role under Harold Wilson or Jim Callaghan?
Well, Jim was kind enough to ask me twice to join the government. And on both occasions, when he became Prime Minister first and then a year or so later, I had to say to him, because I greatly admired and liked Jim Callaghan. Not although many people actually liked Jim, but I'd known him since the early 1960s, since 61, because I was a student in Cardiff University. And of course, he was the Member of Parliament for Cardiff South East. And I'd been active in the City Party. So I'd known him, and we had a friendly, not fond, but friendly relationship. He would always help, for instance, by coming to speak to the Students' Union Socialist Society, of which I was chairman. So we got on very well. And I could speak to him as an older friend, not just as the Prime Minister. And I had to say to him when he asked me if I wanted to join the government, that it would be very dishonest, because I was engaged in trying to move the government from its public expenditure policy to what I thought would be a more sensible policy. And then on the second occasion, I was deeply engaged in organizing the defeat of the government's proposals for devolution in Wales. So I said, Jim, I couldn't honestly become a minister when I've got such basic reservations, opposition in two crucial areas of government policy. I would very much like to, in other circumstances. I would certainly like to serve your government, but you do understand. And he did. He never held any grudges. Our friendship and familiarity continued, but I don't think it would have benefited me a hell of a lot. I know that when I did run for the leadership and was elected as leader of the Labour Party and of the opposition, people said I was very inexperienced, etc., etc., etc. I think that on that score, most people who attain high political office, whether the President of the United States or certainly in the case of John Kennedy, he'd been a senator for a few years, which didn't begin to compare with the office of president, obviously. And then there are many other instances of people who have got the aptitude, the skills required to fulfill senior political roles, who haven't done an apprenticeship in those roles, but they know their trade. They know what leadership requires, and they get on with it. And I just hope I was one of those people. So I don't think that a couple of years as a junior minister would equip me any better to be leader of the opposition. And, the history of those who have had experience of senior office before becoming leaders of their parties is, to say the very least, mixed. I can't help thinking, when you asked that question, of Mrs. Truss, who'd enjoyed several senior roles in government, and what she last 44 days as Prime Minister. Anyway, there you go.
I mean, it's certainly a fair point to make. In Kevin Hickson's book, in the interview for that, you mentioned he had a great deal of involvement with the formation of Labour's National Policy Forum. And in that interview, you suggested
I designed it entirely.
Yeah, you designed it entirely. Yes, apologies.
No, don't apologize. I mean, I stole the idea from the Swedish Social Democrats. So I can't claim the genius of inventing the idea. I took the idea from the Swedish Social Democratic Workers' Party because I'd observed their system in action, and I adapted it. Obviously, you couldn't transport it whole to British conditions. It's never been properly used, unfortunately.
Yeah,
but anyway,
yes. My question was, what do you think? How could it be better used, and what kind of effect do you think, if it was better used, it would have on the way that Labour formulates? I mean,
the basic concept is of engagement by legitimate representatives across the party, geographically, in terms of their distinctive roles, and politically, in the formulation and development of policy, so that there are on the policy forum representatives of every part of the United Kingdom. There are those who have backgrounds in trade unionism, in local government, crucially, people who have expertise in so-called women's issues and concerns. Youth are there, guaranteed representation. Go through the whole spectrum of society and political experience and expertise, and they constitute proportionately the membership of the forum. The function of the forum then is to take policy proposals coming from constituency parties, trade unions, regions, interest groups, affiliated societies, like the Fabian Society or the Labour Movement for Europe or the Cooperative Party, whatever. And by giving consideration to various proposals and very thoroughly analyzing the utility and potential impact, to develop a body of policy. which can then be submitted to, in the Swedish case, their biennial Congress, in the Labour Party's case, the annual conference, for further due diligence and assent, rejection, modification by the conference, acting under the guidance of the National Executive Committee and of the Shadow Cabinet. Those roles firmly installed. Now, the problem of underuse or underexploitation, maybe that's a better word, comes from the fact that before I could convene a national policy forum, all I could do was design it, propose it, get it adopted and included in the Labour Constitution, because I then ran out of time. We had the 1992 general election. John Smith came in, and although a very diligent and effective leader, as he had been a shadow spokesman, very smart guy, never fully comprehended the purpose and potential of the National Policy Forum. And I offered to get members of the Swedish Social Democrats, or as it happened, one member of parliament who was a member of the Labour Party, and because he was half Swedish and spoke fluent Swedish, was a member of the Swedish Social Democratic Party, to explain to John what the thinking behind the idea was. The offer was never taken up. I made the same offer to Tony Blair when he followed John, so that when the National Policy Forum came together, I actually went to the first meeting in, I think, 1993, and it was, I thought, well, this is a talking shop that's never going to be used unless somebody gets hold of it. Anyway, nobody ever really did get hold of it, but understandably, some would say inevitably, when confronted by this policy formulation process, leadership would wonder how it could be manipulated to conform with leadership preferences. That's just natural. It's not anti-democratic or any nonsense like that. It's just what leaders would do. I guess it's what I would have done if the policy forum existed when I was leader, because you want to ensure coherence in policy, but also adherence to your preference. And that's been the story, really, of the National Policy Forum. So it's never been fully exploited as a means of policy development, and it's evolved into a means of, on a good day, endorsing the leadership preferences, which, is good in terms of party cohesion. It's just that I think we might be missing some inventive and useful ideas by not giving it a freer rein. There's one real difficulty in the UK, of course, in trying to emulate the Swedish and indeed now Norwegian and Danish model, because the Norwegians and the Danes have got similar arrangements. So to some extent, as the Social Democrats in Germany. But they don't operate in an environment in which the press is only looking for rifts, leaks, antagonisms, divisions, so that in those countries, I'm not saying that they can operate with impunity or total independence or ignorance of the political environment. Of course they can. But the political environment in Britain is more subject to the hostile press looking for means of causing problems for the Labour Party than is the case in those countries. So there's an inhibition on the work of the National Policy Forum that will always be difficult to deal with unless and until such processes become part of the natural activity of political parties in the UK, democratic political parties. So, it's an idea that still has to be fully developed. And that's when 32 years after I invented it, there you go. It's really only of interest to real, deeply embedded anoraks.
I'll take that as a compliment.
It's okay.
Well, I'd agree. I think most of the people watching the podcast will be as well.
Okay, well, fine. Welcome to the tribe.
So for the second part of the interview, I'm going to be talking more about present day issues and also where your views sort of stand on those. And so, of course, you mentioned the Swedish Social Democrats, and we focus a lot at looking at Nordic policies in different countries and how they work. So
Yeah.
are there any other lessons that Labour can learn from Nordic social democratic parties? And more generally, are there lessons the Labour Party could take away from, the way those Nordic countries run politically?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we're not describing utopia around the Baltic Sea. I want to make that very clear. However, by any measure, these societies are more fulfilled, more economically productive in many ways, and certainly more secure societies with greater opportunity than our country. And if I had a wish, it would be that in Britain, Labour had started earlier, around about 1931, and more consistently been in government in order to sustain the idea that the welfare society has to be a productive society in order to ensure that the resources necessary for maintaining high quality of social provision, protection, and opportunity are maintained. Well, of course, that wish could never come true. And therefore, we're left with the tasks confronting us now. The feature of the Nordic social democracies that most people recognize and understand is very high quality and quantity of social provision, which has to be paid for by quite high levels of taxation. And there is a willingness to make that contribution from taxpayers that is not recognizable amongst sufficient numbers in the United Kingdom. And the reason why they contribute without a great deal of complaint and finance very high quality health, education, social care, opportunity throughout the society, regardless of background, gender, or age, is that they can see a connection directly between the level of their contributions through a fair taxation system and the standard of provision that's made. And that means that consensus is sustained even when they have conservative governments or indeed quite extreme right-wing parties who either give support to coalition governments or are not very ferocious in their opposition. That's a social consensus that almost defies political boundaries. Now, I'm not looking for support from ideological conservatives or populists, but I know that it's always been absolutely vital for Labour to be able to establish high quality and connect satisfaction with those outcomes to a readiness to contribute. That requires two things. First of all, the quality, which is observable, which is experienced. The hospital bed is there. The school class is small. The achievements of cures and treatments, the achievements scholastically and vocationally are manifest. But it also requires a fair taxation system, which we haven't got in Britain yet. And it's been made more unfair, certainly in the last 14 years. And before that, during the Thatcher years. And those years weren't sufficiently or totally overcome by the 13 Labour years. So we've got a system that inflicts higher taxation on earnings than on owning. And that imbalance has got to be gradually corrected if we're going to get tax revenues that don't inflict severe charges on working people, but obtain fair revenues from unearned incomes, asset appreciation, ownership of land, and other assets that have risen monumentally in value in the last 40-odd years and are barely taxed. The dealing with the non-doms is just, I hope, the start of that, not for punitive reasons. Nobody's out to punish anybody, but in order that all of the sources of wealth in society are fairly levied so that they can finance improvements across both the economy and society. Now, they've achieved something like that. It's not perfect by any means in the Nordic economies, and we must seek to emulate that. Because apart from anything else, they produce what by any of the recognized measures are more contented, happier, enjoyable societies. And I'm all in favor of enjoyment.
I agree. So to move on slightly to more recent events, you endorsed Vaughan Gething in the Welsh Labour leadership.
Yes.
And I was reading through some of the articles on there, and one came up, and I'm sure you'll know them, but from Nation Cymru. And there was the headline there, of course, which was Labour's most prominent anti-devolutionist in response to yourself. And the only reason that they're given there, of course, is that you were against the devolution reforms of 1979. So do you feel that your views have changed since then? And would you say that really, you've always been pro-devolution, or would you say that actually you've had sort of your own journey of whether
No, I've always been in favor of devolution and decentralization of power. And I don't expect whatever newspaper that was to recognize it. But I was making the argument back in the 1970s that if the decentralization of power was a good idea for Wales and Scotland, it was a good idea for everybody in what I recognized then was an over-centralized state and system of government. And one of the reasons that I was very hostile to the form of devolution that was being proposed by Jim Callaghan's government was because it was what I called sole thumb devolution, that it was definitely a concession to nationalism, not an effort to democratize the government of the United Kingdom. And that wasn't an ideological point, it was a very practical point. And I think that the results in the referendum tended to show that I was rather more, rather closer to sentiment in my constituency and in Wales than those who were trying to introduce that form of devolution. In my constituency, we won by 9-1, and in Wales, we won by 4-1. Matters developed after that, and Tony Blair introduced something like the original concept. Now, that reminds me that my arguments in 1979 were about the block grant, the means that had been developed by the then Financial Secretary of the Treasury, a dear friend of mine, Joel Barnett, for trying to make allocations of finance proportionately to Scotland and Wales. Now, Joel said about his own creation that he was back of a fag packet. And within months of actually introducing the system, Joel was arguing for its reform. He did that until his dying day, very effectively in the House of Lords, where I was sitting alongside him when he continued to make arguments for the radical reform of his system. And the core of the problem is this, that the Barnett formula in 1979 could not and did not take proper account of the different levels of challenge in Scotland, whether industrial or rural, or Wales, industrial or rural, in transition. And it just so happens that the inherited poverty of Wales leads to higher levels of morbidity, illness across the generations. And the nature of the needs of Wales is different from the nature of the needs of Oxfordshire. It's quite similar to the needs of County Durham, Northumberland, even parts of the Midlands. And we need a different formulation, because the problem is that if devolution isn't backed up by adequate, proportionate, utilitarian resources, then it's all responsibility without real power. And that doesn't enhance democracy, it actually weakens it. It doesn't attract people to engage in the process of decision making, it alienates them. And we can see it, for instance, in the constant taunting by Tories of Wales and National Health Service performance. By some measurements, in some areas of some services, Wales is doing better than England. But in terms of major salient measurements, waiting times, ambulance delays, cancer cures, and so on, Wales is behind, simply because there aren't the proportionate resources that are relevant to the needs of Wales made available by the Barnett formula and the system of treasury allocations. So, I've embraced devolution because it exists, we've got to get on with it. And as individual members of the Senedd would tell you, wherever I can support efforts to try and attract investment or make the argument for more effective financing, I readily, happily do that because I want it now to work. We've got it, and it would serve nobody's purpose by continuing to be antagonistic to the concept. I do make the argument, along with Gordon Brown, my dear comrade, that there is a case for devolution across the United Kingdom. Excuse me, that's asthma. And I hope that with Labour's commitment to decentralisation of power, we shall see that come to pass. I just wish it had happened 40 odd years ago. I think we'd be in a different position, both in the deprived areas and neglected areas of England and in Wales and Scotland, probably Northern Ireland too. And who knows, if there was adequate devolved finance to Northern Ireland with its particular salient issues, we might not have had the repeated pauses in democratic government in that part of the United Kingdom. Anyway, they are all arguments that develop out of the basic question, how are we governed? And at the moment, in the United Kingdom, for various historic and political reasons, and against a particular economic background of deindustrialization, we are not well governed. I'd like to change that. Devolution to the whole United Kingdom is part of the answer to that. And I just wish that whatever nationalist newspaper you were quoting catches up with that reality. Though, of course, nationalists, by definition, have got a vested interest in perpetual grievance for reasons we all understand.
Is it true that you were originally more sceptical of proportional representation, and how much did the 1987 and 1992 elections shift your view on that issue?
Well, my view shifted most of all after the 1983 election. I had been skeptical about proportional representation, partly and mistakenly, as far as I'm concerned, because of the kind of people who were seeking to promote it. And I had a lot of political differences with them on other grounds. And as I say, mistakenly, I confused the proposal with the people proposing it, which is never, well, no, I wouldn't say never, is often not a good idea. So 1983 comes, and as I said earlier, in a slightly different context, Mrs. Thatcher got elected with a majority, I think, of 41, with 43% of the vote, and naturally all of the elected power, which she used ruthlessly. And on reflection, after 83, I thought, wait a minute, there's something really wrong here, because for all the years since 1951, the Conservatives have continually benefited from a divided anti-Conservative vote. And we need to try and take out insurance against that. There are two ways of doing it. One that will never happen, and that's the unification of the Liberal and Labour parties. And the other one, which is constitutional reform, which I think is worth working for. The nearest I managed to come to promoting that when I was leader of the party was I set up a commission, and a lovely man, very professor of politics in Southampton University, with various experts on the commission to examine ways of securing more proportionate election and government. And he reported, I think, quite shortly after I stopped being leader. And it's a form of single transferable vote system. And I think that it would benefit our country because it would permit the retention of constituencies and make representation more proportionate, not perfectly proportionate. I think there are errors in going to a perfectly proportionate system because it gives undue significance to tiny minority parties. And I don't think that helps the democratic system, but a more proportionate system, which is constituency-based, is what I favor.
So for my final question, of course, Labour looks likely to re-enter government, although nothing is certain with any election.
That's right.
Do you think that you'll be offering them any advice or anything? So for my,
I hate backseat driving. If my comrades, who I hugely admire and value, if they ask my opinion, either on something that they're doing or would like to do, or if I got any ideas, I'm more than happily offer it. And that's the relationship. But I would never seek to advise on detail or navigation, because it used to irritate the hell out of me when people tried to do that with me, even when it was immensely friendly advice, very well intentioned. You know, I said to one or two of them, look, I hear what you say. You're not sitting in my seat. There are considerations that I either can't or won't go into to explain why we're doing what we're doing in the way that we're doing it. So you'll have to just bear with me. And because they were friends, they did. And I just would hate to think that Keir or Rachel or any of the people leading the party now were getting advice, demands, suggestions from me that constituted backseat driving. The only people who can drive are the ones behind the wheel.
I have one final question, slightly funner question than that. One thing that I've always wanted to ask you, Neil, is about a music video you were in the 1980s with Tracey Ullman. With Tracey Ullman, and I just wondered, how did that come about?
Tracey's people, her agent or somebody, contact the office and asked if I would appear in this music video. And initially, I didn't give it a second thought. And then I mentioned it to my daughter, who was, how old was she? 11 at the time. And she said, oh, I'd love to meet Tracey Ullman. So I said, okay, right, I'll do it. So that's why I did it. It led to the foundation of a friendship that endures now. I'll be going out for lunch with Tracey in a couple of weeks' time. And a lovely daughter. She's got a great daughter who's also very political. And Tracey's as good as gold. And she's still the ebullient Tracey that she was when she was in her late teens, I guess she was then. And she's a star and great company. So, yeah, I don't think it did me any good electorally, although we did get to number 8 in the charts. I've got to remember that. But I don't think it did a great deal of harm. I mean, the people who were determined to target my inexperience and immaturity and lack of gravitas and all that bloody rubbish, they would have done it anyway. I mean, I got the same treatment. I went to an old age pensioners rally in Westminster Central Hall and to make a speech, a serious speech. And outside the hall, I met Roy Hudd, Bill Owen, a couple of other good old Labour performers of stage and silver screen. And it started to rain. And Bill, for some reason or other, had a top hat. So I got his top hat, put it on, and we did Singing in the Rain together on the pavement, to the delight of the old age pensioners going into the hall. So I went into the hall, made the speech, got a very good response, standing ovation, all the rest of it. And I enjoyed myself. I was with my chums. No better company in the world than Bill Owen and Roy Hudd and people like that. And Corporal Jones was there as well. Clive was a lovely man. So we did, the four of us, Singing in the Rain. And that, of course, was represented as making me unfit for office. So I don't know whether it was because of the inadequacy of my dancing or my singing, though that was pretty good at the time. I think it might have had something to do with the fact that they hated Labour politics.
Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, Neil. It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.